They saw them before they understood them. American soldiers rolled into the outskirts of a small German town just after dawn, expecting silence, maybe a white flag, maybe frightened civilians peeking from windows. Instead, their jeep slowed to a stop for a different reason. Bodies hung from lampposts along the main road. They weren't in uniforms. They were civilians, old men in worn coats, women in simple dresses, a boy who looked barely old enough to shave. Each body swayed slightly in the cold morning air. Around their necks hung wooden signs. The words were crudely painted, but the message was clear. "Here hangs a traitor." These people hadn't attacked anyone. They hadn't fired a shot. Their crime was simple. They had tried to surrender. The American soldiers stared in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. There was no briefing for this, no map that explained it. Just confusion and a rising, ugly question forming in every mind. What kind of man does this to his own people? Only hours earlier, everything had felt different. It was March 1945, and to most Allied soldiers, the war already felt like it was ending. German resistance was crumbling across the front. Town after town had surrendered without a fight. Columns of prisoners shuffled west, exhausted and relieved that it was finally over. American units advanced with confidence, even impatience. This was supposed to be routine. Another town, another brief negotiation, maybe a tense moment, then a flag, then forward again. The soldiers joked in their vehicles. Some talked about home. Some talked about how strange it felt that after years of fighting, the enemy now seemed to be collapsing all at once. No one expected trouble here. Certainly no one expected to find civilians hanging in the streets for daring to believe the war was finished. As patrols pushed deeper into the town, the truth revealed itself piece by piece. Houses with white sheets still half hidden in windows, hastily torn down. Doors hanging open where people had been dragged out. Blood on the cobblestones, already dark and drying. A captured resident, shaking and barely able to speak, finally explained it. Anyone who tried to surrender was punished. Anyone who showed a white flag was accused of betrayal. Some were shot. Others were hanged publicly as a warning. The message was unmistakable. Surrender meant death. The Americans didn't feel sadness when they heard this. They felt something harder. Anger. Cold, focused anger. This wasn't a town resisting invasion. This was a town being terrorized into fighting. And someone, somewhere inside, was responsible. That someone had a name. Major Emil Keller. He was not famous. He was not brilliant. He would never be remembered for winning a battle. But he believed fanatically in obedience. Keller was a true believer in Nazi ideology, long after many of his fellow officers had accepted reality. By March 1945, most German commanders were quietly looking for ways to end the fighting with as little bloodshed as possible. Keller was different. He had received a direct order to hold the town at all costs. Defend to the last stone. To him, those words were not symbolic. They were literal. History, civilians, even basic humanity meant nothing compared to obedience. He believed surrender was treason, mercy was weakness, and fear was a tool. Anyone who questioned him was an enemy, even if they were German. Keller didn't have an army in the traditional sense. The experienced units were gone, destroyed, or retreating. What he had instead was the population itself. Old men handed rifles they barely knew how to use. Teenagers pulled from classrooms and forced into uniforms. Wounded soldiers dragged from hospital beds and told to fight or be shot. Keller made his ultimatum clear. Anyone who attempted to surrender would be executed. Anyone who raised a white flag would be hanged. Families were warned that defiance would mean collective punishment. The town didn't become a fortress. It became a prison. Fear replaced choice, survival meant obedience, and the Americans, still believing they were walking into a normal surrender, had no idea what waited for them. When U.S. infantry finally moved in, they did so carefully. They advanced slowly, weapons lowered, eyes searching for signs of surrender. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. Then the first shot rang out. Then another. Machine gun fire erupted from windows and rooftops. A rocket slammed into a wall, showering debris across the road. The Americans dove for cover, stunned. The fire wasn't coming from organized defensive positions. It was everywhere. From basements, from church towers, from alleyways, and then came the realization that froze many of them in place. Some of the people firing weren't soldiers. They were civilians. Men in civilian coats, women dropping grenades from upper floors. Teenagers firing rifles with shaking hands. The Americans hesitated. They didn't want to shoot women. They didn't want to shoot children. That hesitation cost lives. Medics ran forward as men screamed for help. What was supposed to be an easy entry turned into chaos within minutes. Confusion spread. Orders overlapped. No one understood what kind of battle this was supposed to be. As casualties mounted, reports began to reach the command post outside the town. Scouts confirmed what the soldiers had already sensed. Civilians had been executed for trying to surrender. Bodies were displayed as warnings. This was not resistance. This was coercion. The tone of the conversation changed instantly. What had begun as a liberation was turning into something darker. Officers looked at maps they no longer trusted. They looked at casualty lists that were growing too fast. And slowly, an unspoken realization took hold. This was no longer about capturing a town. This was about stopping a man who had turned his own people into weapons. A decision was coming, and once it was made, there would be no turning back. The final confirmation arrived just before nightfall. Scouts returned with photographs, witness statements, and grim certainty. The bodies on the lampposts were not isolated acts. They were policy. Civilians had been executed on direct orders for attempting to surrender. Some had been hanged in public squares. Others shot behind their homes. The officers listening to the reports didn't interrupt. No one argued. The room felt different now. This was no longer a confused situation or a tragic misunderstanding. A clear line had been crossed. The tone shifted from restraint to resolve. These men were not debating tactics anymore. They were deciding how to stop a crime in progress. What followed would not be framed as punishment, but as necessity. If this continued, more civilians would die. More American soldiers would die. Doing nothing was no longer an option. The commanders reached a hard conclusion. They would not send more infantry into those streets. They would not ask young soldiers to fight door against civilians forced to shoot at them. That kind of warfare belonged to another century. This was not about bravery or honor anymore. It was about outcomes, efficiency over heroics, technology over tradition. Orders went out quickly. Infantry units were pulled back to the outskirts. Defensive positions were abandoned. Radios crackled with new instructions. Heavy weapons were requested. Artillery units were brought forward. Air support was coordinated. The explanation was blunt and unemotional. This was not revenge. It was prevention. Every minute the town remained intact. Keller could keep killing his own people and sacrificing more lives for ideology. Ending the battle fast would save lives even if the method itself looked brutal. The bombardment began at first light. There was no dramatic charge, no shouted commands. Just methodical preparation. Artillery crews aligned their guns with careful precision. This was not long-range fire. The barrels were lowered. The distance was short. When the first shells hit, entire buildings simply vanished. Timber frames disintegrated. Stone walls collapsed inward. Fire followed quickly, spreading from house to house. The shelling moved in a pattern, block by block, street by street. Nothing was random. Nothing was rushed. From the hills outside the town, American soldiers watched in silence. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They understood exactly why this was happening. Inside the town, the world Keller had tried to control was being erased. Smoke rose in thick columns. The sound was constant, heavy, unavoidable. It felt less like a battle and more like an ending. Even as the town burned, Major Keller refused to surrender. He had retreated to a stone fortress overlooking the ruins, convinced that endurance alone was victory. Inside, his remaining men were exhausted and terrified. Teenage soldiers cried openly. Wounded men begged for permission to leave. They could hear the shells striking closer and closer. They could smell the smoke. Keller shouted orders that no longer inspired anyone. When some suggested surrender, he threatened them with his pistol. This was fanaticism collapsing under its own weight. Loyalty held together by fear does not survive pressure for long. As the fortress shook with repeated impacts, Keller's authority drained away. His ideology offered no protection against fire and steel. One by one, his men stopped believing. The white flag appeared in the morning. It emerged slowly from a shattered opening in the fortress wall, barely visible through the smoke. The shelling stopped. Silence fell in a way that felt unreal after days of destruction. Survivors began to stumble out, coughing, covered in dust and ash. They looked less like soldiers and more like ghosts. Finally, Keller stepped out. He was still wearing his uniform. His medals were still pinned neatly to his chest. He walked with rigid posture, defiant even now. He tried to speak. No one listened. There was no salute, no respect. Military police took his weapons and led him away without ceremony. From cellars and ruins, civilians emerged. They did not cheer him. They spat at him. They cursed him. This was the legacy of his obedience. When the reports reached General George S. Patton, his reaction was brief and cold. He reviewed the situation, the casualties, the photographs of the town. He understood immediately what had happened and why. Patton did not deliver a speech. He did not express regret. He summed it up in a single statement that spread quickly through the ranks. American lives would not be traded for enemy buildings. The lesson was clear. This was not an exception. It was a warning. From that point on, messages were sent ahead of advancing units. Surrender early or face overwhelming force. Most towns chose surrender. The destruction worked not because it was cruel, but because it was final. The town was nearly destroyed. Civilian casualties were high. American losses were significant, though far fewer than they would have been in prolonged street fighting. Keller survived the battle, but not its judgment. He was tried not for fighting the enemy, but for murdering his own civilians. He was convicted. His name became synonymous with fanaticism taken too far. The event reshaped how future advances were handled. Thousands of lives were likely saved because surrender came sooner elsewhere. But the question never disappeared. Was this justice or was it a war crime? Was destruction the only answer or simply the fastest one? History still argues over it. That question is yours now. What would you have done? If you want more uncensored stories from the front lines of history, stories that don't offer easy answers, subscribe to the channel and join the discussion. The next story is already waiting.